I'll be speaking to Denys Pilash, who is in Kyiv, Ukraine. He's a political scientist in Socialny Ruch, which translates as social movement, and is on the board of the Commons Journal of Social Criticism. On a Zoom event last week that was talking about the 2014 uprising in Ukraine, Denys made a comment that people constantly talk about the supposed conspiracy directed by US official Victoria Nuland during the 2013-14 winter. But none of these people know the names of the actual Ukrainians killed or beaten during those protests. So I wanted to learn more about that. So I asked Denys Pilash for an interview, and he agreed. Good afternoon, Denys.
Hello.
As I understand it, the Maidan demonstration started with student protests in 2013. Could you give some background?
Well, first of all, we need to say that there is, in recent Ukrainian history, there was a strife of these constant mobilizations. Every several years, we had some big protest event. And well, one of them was this 2013 Maidan protest. And well, it was triggered by some geopolitical decisions made by the government, but actually it had lots of other reasons for its unfolding. And yes, it's often framed as being this first stage as mostly a youth protest, and that this first brutal dispersal of the protest on the night of 30th November was the dispersal beating up the students. But it wasn't exclusively student, and well, and it wasn't even so much framed as like they are students, but it was mostly framed in some terms of pro-democracy, pro-European, and so on.
So in these first protests, you talk about people being beaten. How bad was it? Were people killed at this stage or badly injured?
They were badly injured, but it was something like a last drop, because previous years we've seen some looming of police brutality and protest against police brutality. So we had just prior to this Maidan protests, there were events like policemen killing a student who was taken to their police department called the Harindilo, or a natural uprising in a small town or village where a local woman was raped and killed by a group of people, including a policeman. And this led to some huge outrage of the population, because it was indicative of a more broad police brutality, police violence. And then we had this event that like the protest culminated in a very brutal dispersal, beating up by the riot police. And well, I had an experience many years prior to that, when we were staging a protest against this the local government, the local administration in Kyiv was increasing very dramatically the fare for public transportation in the city. And this protest was also dispersed by the Ukrainian riot police, Berkut, at that point. And it's really brutal. So it's no wonder that the public reaction was like that.
Do you know some of the names of the people who were hurt in those November protests?
We know mostly the names of the people who were hurt and killed in the upfolding this of a standoff between the protesters and the police, because the first killings were in January, and the first one was Serhiy Nihayan, who was ethnic Armenian young guy. I think he was sports teacher by his education, and like he was killed in cold blood because he wasn't violent by the policeman. So this was the first victim who was actually killed with firearms by the police, and then the next month, February, came this infamous massacre on the Institutska Street, where almost 100 people have been killed.
So let me go back a step. So in November was the first big protest, brutally put down, and then people, instead of running home, people got angry and came to the Maidan in Kyiv, and they were there in January. And were you there at that point yourself?
Yes, and well, you see, for our group and for many other leftists, the first stage was actually dubious because it was about the signing the association agreement with the EU, and actually the Yanukovych government was it has led, as all previous governments, it was very neoliberal and very corrupt, and it has led the budget to some deficit, and they were desperate in finding where they can get foreign loans, and so they did a U-turn. So they first declared that they will, though Yanukovych was generally perceived as a pro-Russian and a member of a pro-Russian party of the biggest capitalist in Ukraine, the Party of Regions. But despite this, he at some point declared that Ukraine is going to sign this agreement. And then at the last stage, he stepped back and made this U-turn and went to Russia for money to close this hole in the budget. But obviously, it went with political demands on the side of the Kremlin. And we saw this, that it's all these models, all these orientations, be it Western or pro-Russian, they are while controversial, and they are not so benefitable for Ukrainian economy. So we supported the political part of the association agreement with the EU that brought more guarantees.
Wait. You say you supported the political part of what?
Of the association agreement with the EU that has to be
okay.
signed. But we didn't support the free trade zone due to its obviously neoliberal nature. But after this police brutality, it was something like a point of no return, that we understand that if the government prevails and it suppresses this protest, it also suppresses any kind of independent activity, and Ukraine becomes something more akin to Lukashenko's Belarus.
So you went down. So you personally went down to the Maidan.
Yes. So
did you go every day, or did you camp there?
First time we were there in a very organized manner. It was immediately after this dispersal. There was a big spontaneous, huge, at least half of million people, a spontaneous march against police brutality. And we had there a column with leftist, anarchist, and trade unionist activists, as it was very specific about this no to police state demand. And in general, we were attending, trying to attend all these major events that occurred usually on weekends, where more people could join. But we also tried to be there on a regular basis, like everyday basis. And of course, here comes this complicated part, because when you have 500,000 or 1,000,000 people on the streets, you really have this huge diversity of people, both from Kiev and from other regions. And actually, these events, they were not just in Kiev; they were throughout the country. And you have a really more inclusive space. And in this different, when we and our allies did different interventions with leftist, feminist, progressive agenda on some of these like smaller everyday standings there. Sometimes we were confronted by the not so numerous but active far right that tried to like push the leftists out of the protest. But actually, there were lots of initiatives inside this spontaneous movement that were mostly run by left-wing people. Like there was this, some point the police started to detain and kidnap people from the hospital, the same people who have been mistreated, who have been beaten up. And then the police comes to the hospital and takes them to the custody or to unknown places. And so there was this so-called hospital guard that activists were actually guarding. They were helping the injured people to get to the hospital, and they were like doing the full day guard, not them to be kidnapped by the police. And it was mostly done by the leftists.
This is let's say December of 13, or is this January of 14?
This is December, January,
okay,
February. So this was like almost throughout. So, but the situation was escalating, and there was another milestone on the 16th of January, when the parliament, like controlled by the ruling party of regions, it pushed through a package of laws that they were effectively outlawing any kind of independent activity. That meant also that that freedom of assembly, freedom of organization, freedom of protest, freedom of speech, freedom of union organizing that existed, it will be severely restricted to this like authoritarian way. And after this point, it was again something that that led to this situation where either the protest wins or the government suppresses everyone, notwithstanding with their political affiliation or attitude towards even this particular protest. But if they are not controlled by the state and by the ruling party, so they will be effectively outlawed and persecuted for this.
So what was the reaction of people to this these proposed laws? Were they proposed, or did they actually pass these?
They were passed through the parliament on this day. And well, actually, this was the start when up to this moment the Maidan protests were mostly peaceful. So you had a huge number of people who were gathering there. There was like the people who were staying there in the tents, though it was like winter, and but they were keeping the control over the square, and they were doing all the infrastructure and feeding those who were joining and so on. and you had the people who were joining this bigger protests. But from this moment, it seems that this is a dead end. That it now means that the authorities, the political power, the state, the government, they will start political persecutions of the protesters, and that opposition, those guys who afterwards came to power after Maidan, that they have no strategy, no viable strategy what to do in this case. So they were even more discredited in the eyes of the general protesting population. And this led to these first major clashes in the Hrushevskoe Street that were actually more like an act of some desperation. So they started on the 19th of January, like 3 days after, and I know it precisely because that's the day when every year we commemorate victims of far-right violence, because at this day, two of our comrades, the labor lawyer, not labor, but human rights in general lawyer, Stanislav Markelov, and the Crimean journalist Anastasia Baburova, who were both very prominent left-wing anti-fascist figures in Russia. They were killed by Russian neo-Nazis. So throughout the region, there were these days when we commemorate and also say no to this political and far-right violence. And this was precisely the same day when, just in a couple of hundreds of meters, these clashes between the protesters and the police began, because it was, everyone perceived that there will be an ultimate dispersal of the protest, and then there will be political processes against them, and that so if we don't act in any way, so we are all doomed.
So this is January 19th. The old tactics seem to be coming to a dead end, and then there's some violence is starting. Okay, so then what happens? We come to February, where there's tremendous violence.
Yeah, so at the same time, the government loses its legitimacy, and I mentioned these protests throughout the regions, like in central, northern, and the western parts of Ukraine mostly, but they were also smaller in eastern and southern. You have a situation when the government actually starts to lose also some effective control. So it's again, like in many revolts and revolutions of the past, some point when this all the police forces and all the brute force that is manifested by those in power, it cannot suppress a discontent that is so widespread that it prevails. So actually, at this point, there were already first protesters killed, and there was this. Then there were trying to get some political negotiating and mediating the crisis, but ultimately Yanukovych gave another order to disperse the Maidan Square, disperse the protesters from there, and this final clash with the riot police, it resulted to these shootings, and again, there are lots of conspiracy theories and some explanations that try to invoke some third side and so on. But there is effect that the majority of those people who have been killed on the Institutska Street, the street that goes from Maidan Square to the governmental area, they were killed by police bullets, by the riot police bullets, and that, like, obviously, the government and the riot police was the main culprits for everything that happened. So
you wait, but let me stop you here. So talk a minute about the conspiracy theories. One hears in the United States, some people say, oh, it's so uncertain who shot who. It might have been the protesters sending people with guns to shoot up themselves so they would get more sympathy. I mean, we hear that conspiracy theory at times.
The first bullets were, it's proven that they were shot by the riot police, and the vast majority, you can just look at the data about these people, who were killed. So, for instance, we lost an anarchist guy whom many of us got acquainted during this protest. He was actually a non-violence advocate, more of an anarcho-pacifist. He was called Serhiy Kemsky, and he originally comes from Crimea. And actually, he was one of the most peaceful persons you can imagine. Yes, he was among those who were killed by these police bullets.
How many were killed in February? Shot?
So we can check the precise number, but it was like it was less than 100, but I think it's less than 90 people who were killed.
Mm-hmm. So you have all these crowds and protests, and the government says it's going to stop, and then it turns violent, and then there's this last spasm by the government. 90 people or so are killed. I assume many were injured too. And then it all fell apart for the government. Is that right?
Yeah. And it fell apart very miserably. So President Yanukovych, again, it's often when you see these narratives from those skeptical about Maidan protests, so they will emphasize that he was a legitimate president and so on. But actually, he, when in power, he extended his powers, and he actually reversed the constitutional reform in Ukraine that gave more powers to the parliament than to the president, because originally President Kuchma, who was actual architect of Ukrainian oligarchic capitalism, he made very, very vast presidential powers for himself. And then already during the first Maidan in 2004, then there was agreed that will be this transition of some powers to the parliament, but actually Yanukovych concentrated more powers in his hands, and he was acting in a way that he was monopolizing that power that broke this fragile hybrid oligarchical semi-democratic system in Ukraine, and that was leading to a more authoritarian type of oligarchy from this more or less electoral authoritarian model. So yes, so Yanukovych, he when everything fell apart, even even at the stage when it wasn't yet decided, but he fled with his vast wealth. So it was they were packing lots of lorries, I don't know, cars with different fancy stuff, and so he fled from his one of his residences that then was turned into almost an amusement park, because it's so large, and he had ostriches there, and different type of exotic, I know, animals and stuff and so on. And then he fled from Kiev, and ultimately very soon he fled from Ukraine, and this also gave this starting point for Putin's administration in Russia to start its own game against Ukrainian territorial integrity.
Maybe we'll get into that in another interview. But so where were you at this point when Yanukovych fled? Were you living in Maidan or going there, or how was it for you personally?
At that point, though I was for more than a month, I was living near Maidan, but at that point I was in my native city, and I was following all this from a distance with utter horror, like with this online doom watching the TV.
Right.
What's going on?
So in summing up, what would you say to those who ignore this vast process of masses in action and say this U.S. official, Victoria Nuland, worked with the Ukrainian far right, and this is what overthrew the government?
You see, what happened in Ukraine wasn't unique to Ukraine, and it wasn't really something staged up. If you look for a literal coup, so yes, you have a lots of examples, be it Guatemala in 1954, or almost the same time in Iran against Mossadegh. But it was like a literal coup with a small number of people who undermine the regime that enjoys huge popularity. And at the same time, Ukraine was in line with those protests that were unleashed after the 2008 financial economic crisis throughout the world, the crisis of the global capitalism, when actually in every country you see a different set of prerequisites, different triggers that started the protests, but you see many similarities. I think that Cihan Tugal, who is a Turkish sociologist, he did a frame for this so-called uprisings like throughout the world that were based in this end of like previous commodities boom, and in the economic crisis of capitalism that was aggravating all these inequalities, all the injustices that exist. So you have the Arab Springs, you have the Taksim Square protest in Turkey, you have the square movements throughout Europe, like from Sintagma in Greece to Indignados and M18 movement in Spain, the uprising or protests in Iceland, in Reykjavik. You have Occupy Wall Street and everything that was brought after the Occupy Wall Street. So you have all of these are very specific, and sometimes and they are very complex. And you have different forces that join these protests. You have different maybe percentage of more progressive and more reactionary forces that try to infiltrate them. But still, the pattern is more or less the same. So you cannot stage up a protest that is supported by millions of people by some special services, by some intelligence meddling and so on. You have millions of people with legitimate grievances, with driven by their feeling of insecurity, by their feeling of enormous inequality existing in the society, by their feeling of lack of political representation, by their feeling of being suppressed by the police state, and so on and so on. So at a very basic level, I think that almost any protesters throughout the world could understand this internal grievance that was moving the protest. One of the big problems in the Ukrainian protest was that it never had the opportunity to articulate these grassroots social demands, these demands that were at their core aimed against that oligarchy capitalist system that reigns in Ukraine, and not only in Ukraine, but instead, still the protests, people were angry at the government, even those who had previously supported Yanukovych. So at the moment of his fleeing the country, his approval ratings were probably somewhere below zero, because the same people who voted for him, they also felt that they are betrayed, even those who were against this protest, but they were very discontented with the level of the corruption and the incompetence that was manifested by him and his closest set of oligarchs. So the problem was that, yes, you had this official agenda that was very liberal, very pro-European. You had like agendas of some other political players, for instance, the nationalist far right, that was actually against everything that was promoted by the Maidan protests. So they were obviously not for parliamentary democracy, not for European integration, and not for some progressive values, but for maybe the only thing that they could use, it was this anti-Yanukovych and anti-Russian sentiment. But they could still push through their own agenda and their own imagery, their own slogans, their own flags. And the big tragedy for us is that as Ukrainian left at that point, it's not just exclusive to Ukraine, it's mostly in Eastern Europe, this dire situation. It was too weak, and to present its own political pole, to present its own political subject, to articulate this anti-oligarchic, anti-capitalist demands that were deeply inside many of the protesters. Though our group at that point was called the Left Opposition, and we distributed thousands of leaflets circulating there with this 12 points or 10 points of social demands, where we were directly stating that the problems of Ukraine, they will not wither, they will persist, and we will have more and more such protests if we don't address the core of them, that is oligarchy capitalist system, and that we need a democratic socialist alternative. But still,
is this the start of the official creation of social movement, or did that happen earlier?
In many cases, this is the start, because so we felt this weakness of the democratic left, of the libertarian left, of the revolutionary left in Ukraine, and this feeling was also shared by, for instance, those organized working class movements who also tried to articulate themselves during the protest. For instance, in the city of Kryvyi Rih, that is roughly the center of Ukraine, a huge industrial city on ore mines and ore refineries, a very long city with it's less than 1 million, but a big population. And by the way, the birthplace of the current Ukrainian president. So there, the local Maidan protest was mostly organized by the unions, by the independent unions of miners. But these people and their leader, Yuri Samoilov, was also very clear that although this was a workers' protest with another set of demands, with a more progressive, more socially and pro-labor oriented demands, but they weren't heard by the official opposition. They weren't heard by these official agendas, and that the working class in Ukraine isn't represented in any position, neither in the government nor in the parliament, neither in the current, at that point, ruling coalition, or how to call it, neither nor in the opposition, the official opposition of liberals and nationalists and so on, and that we need a political subject that will be left-wing and pro-working class. So these were the feelings that we had. We shared, both people who, like the young leftists in Kiev, many of whom, like me, started in a militant student union called Direct Action, and these older workers, trade unions, activists who also had the same. So we started building around this, our group at that point, left opposition, something that was first called Assembly for Social Revolution. And again, it's stated that, albeit the Maidan or Euromaidan protests were in general called a revolution of dignity. That's the same name, I think it was in Tunisia. But it wasn't a revolution, a proper revolution, because it didn't change the system. And we need a social revolution that will change the social system. So this was the meaning of this name. And ultimately, this became our organization, now called the Social Movement, Соціальний рух in Ukrainian.
Well, this has been fascinating. I really appreciate you giving me all this time for this interview, but there's a tremendous amount of detail you gave us, and I think it'll really help with the understanding. So thank you again, and I hope we'll talk again soon.
Thank you so much.